Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Coffee with a Little Bit of Cream. I'm Paul Sutton, and along with Shomari Jones, we're excited to share with you a conversation we had, just the two of us this time, where we explored the meaning of the words equality, equity, and racial equity, and how those meanings are manifested in practices within the educational system. We were inspired to have this conversation by a couple of listeners who pointed out to us that we routinely talk about these concepts, but that we've never really defined what they mean to us. So we hope this conversation provides all of you with a different way to think about these concepts and perhaps inspire you to have similar conversations with folks within your social circle. We thank you for joining us again for this conversation and hope you're well and that you have a great day.
Hey everyone, this is Dr. Catherine Kennedy, founder and executive director of Wellness for Educators. We are so excited to serve as the sister podcast of Coffee with a Little Bit of Cream. We're grateful for the opportunity to cross-post and amplify Shomari Jones and Paul Sutton and their mission as they examine issues that impact education and the education system and ways that issues of race, power, and privilege impact students, educators, schools, districts, and the larger educational system. Here's the next episode for your listening pleasure.
So here we are again, Coffee with a Little Bit of Cream, preparing to have a conversation where we really dissect the definitions of a few terms that we know cause some folks confusion. They are often used interchangeably and incorrectly as we go about our daily work in this education system. And so as suggested by one of our listeners, we're going to take an opportunity to just delve deeply into some formative definitions of a couple of terms that we run across often: equality, equity, racial equity, and really just have some discourse between Paul and I as to our individualized experiences with the delivery of instituting practices around these terms, but also how we would love for some of these terms to be utilized in the spaces that we consider education towards some sort of outcome that is beneficial to those who are on the side of injustice that we want to eradicate. And so as we begin to move forward in today's session, let Paul introduce himself again, and then we'll jump right into some of the definitions and terminologies that we have created for a couple of teams that we sit on and that have been adopted by institutions that we work closely with. And so, Paul, take it away.
Thanks, Shomari. I'm Paul Sutton, Assistant Professor of Education at Pacific Lutheran University in the Pacific Northwest. And like Shomari said, these terms come up all the time in my work, both professionally and also in my work with Shomari. And there seems to be some, not necessarily confusion, but maybe some misunderstanding around what these terms mean. Again, equality, equity, and racial equity, and how they're referred to in the system and in different schools and different districts. So perhaps some framing that we could provide and some deeper understandings that we could provide might help folks gain some clarity so that when they are trying to be advocates in their schools and districts, they can also provide some clarity around the terms and work towards more social justice. So yeah, happy to be here again with everybody.
You know, I want to build on that too, Paul. Of course, we want folks to, listeners to be able to engage in a clarification for their own selves of this terminology, but also as a tenant of this podcast, we would love for folks to also continue to pay it forward by utilizing what you've learned to either engage in discourse with those who are in your like roles or within your sphere of influence, but also engage in spreading your nuanced learning to others that would benefit from having a clearer understanding of this work and how to participate in it.
Yeah, totally agree. It's a huge, I think if folks just understood what these three words meant deeply, I think that we could realize just so much like low hanging fruit change in districts and schools, right? Like there are three really powerful terms that unfortunately get all lumped together and get conflated together, but they actually mean three different things. So, should we start?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So perhaps we should start with equality as a concept, and just what we're going to do, I think, is we're going to provide just a basic working definition, and then Shomari and I are just going to kind of riff off that definition and talk about where we see it occurring in the system and what our understanding is, and then how folks can kind of leverage the term in their own sphere of influence. So, kind of a good working definition of equality is that it refers to the belief that all students, and we're talking here in the educational realm, but it refers to a belief that all students should be afforded the same treatment and access to educational resources and opportunities, regardless of their racial, ethnic, linguistic, socioeconomic status or learning ability. Right. So that's a really basic kind of starting definition. Shomari, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, we've kind of agreed on these over time, but
I mean, my add to this is that equality is just that. It is everyone having equalness, right? I would argue that equality is the goal, but not the journey. It's not what we experience today. It is something that at the end of this, when we've, from the vision of instituting these types of elements in the work that we do around equity, racial equity, on that pathway towards that journey, we have varying things that we must do to reach an output that is everyone equally receiving what they need in order to have an outcome that benefits each individual based on what their individual needs are. And so equality would be everyone gets A's at the end of the semester or the quarter. That's the outcome. We want everyone to be able to thrive and succeed at a level that is indicative of the hard work that they've put into the effort of schooling. But some people need different things in order to get there, and so my equality statement is one of value, and it's a valid terminology, but it is not the journey, it's the end goal.
Yeah. And, I was thinking of this earlier today, Shomari, and the way I think I'm coming to think of equality, because I'm not always personally like, I have a basic definition of what it is in my head, but once I start thinking about what it actually looks like, it gets, I think, really kind of complicated and nuanced. And I think I'm starting to come around to the idea that, what equality means to me in schools is that every child should have access to a meaningful, purposeful education, and they should all have the opportunity to choose what kind of life they want to live. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, when I hear people, like, one of the big criticisms that I think is out there just about equity in general is that, everybody wants, equality of outcomes. And I think to a certain extent that's true. But I also think that, like, to a certain extent, it really depends on what individuals want for themselves. Right. And so we sometimes forget there's like, student and child agency involved in this, right? That, like, we want to give people the opportunity to be able to direct their lives in ways that make sense to them. Mm-hmm. And that'll look different for some folks, right? So, but it's like trying to reach that goal, I think is and giving everybody the opportunity to do that, I think is like a really important way that I think about what equality means.
It's powerful too, because, in this type of environment, K-12 in particular, a more difficult term for me to find resolve with is success. We assign success to other people, right? We don't afford you the opportunity to define success for your own self. And so in your defining of success and how you want to matriculate through this K-12 experience, if we, by the end of your K-12 experience, have reached the goal of ensuring that you have what you want out of this experience, moving on to the next, then I believe we've done our jobs as far as equality is concerned. I don't think equality, and I gave that as an example earlier about everyone having an A. But I don't think equality has anything to do with everyone necessarily reaching the same goal. It is reaching their goal and the goal that they have set for themselves, the goal that their families have helped to construct for them from the time that they've born to the time that they complete K-12 and maybe even college. And so equality for me absolutely does focus on, first and foremost, what that stakeholder wants for themselves out of this experience.
Yeah. I really, really like that distinction because it's naturally empowering to the very folks we're desperately trying to serve in the system, right? It doesn't, one of I think the big issues within the educational system writ large is that so many times school districts are doing what they think is best for families and children and communities without stopping to actually ask those families and students and communities what they actually want for their own children, right? And so they come up with all of these ideas that, oh, this program is the best or that program is the best. We're just going to push this out and everybody will be happy. And, and so I think many times school districts kind of default or they conflate a sense of standardization with a sense of equality that is somewhat dysfunctional and can somewhat be disruptive and destructive to how kids experience the educational setting, right? Teaching and learning. What's interesting, Shomari, is that the district we live in, we actually have a real world example that maybe folks might be able to identify with of how equality policies that are focused on equality work within schools and how just focusing on equality may be a little bit misguided. So back in the early 2000s, the Bellevue School District, we had a very charismatic superintendent by the name of Mike Riley, who has since passed away, but he instituted this policy of opening up AP enrollment to every single student, regardless of who they were, regardless of prior coursework, right? His big belief was every child deserves a rigorous educational experience. So we're going to open up AP coursework to absolutely everyone. And at the time, that was a pretty radical idea. And the Bellevue School District got a lot of really good press from Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report and different places like that. And what we found happened with that is that a ton more kids took AP classes. So the numbers went up and actually the pass rates kind of went up as well. But there was still the same achievement gap that existed between primarily white and Asian students and Black and brown students in those same classes. So what it did is it enabled a bunch more kids to experience AP coursework, but it didn't do anything to try to improve outcomes for the very students it was trying to help, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Right. So it's like pursuing policies that are focused just on equality is a real double-edged sword, because just because you give folks the same opportunity doesn't mean they'll be as successful if there isn't the support there to actually ensure that they can be successful, right? And you and I have talked about this a lot, but I thought that example might be really useful for folks to think of when they think of what equality looks like in a school district.
I'm wondering too, you mentioned board policy. How much is board policy, especially when constructed by board members, sometimes without the inclusion of the voice of the stakeholders they're seeking to serve? How much board policy aligns to equality of how we output what we have as an expectation for students, for families, and for staff, with no gray area, with limited ability for folks to have choice as to how they engage with a circumstance or a situation or a student or family need. Sometimes when we're over-governed by words on paper that give explicit direction that you got to do these things this way, I think that is potentially detrimental to the uniqueness of circumstances. I was reviewing the definition of equality that we constructed for a team that we were currently on, but we formally constructed it. And thinking about like just the ways that everyone experiences life differently, social and emotionally, religiously, language-wise, cultures and customs, etc. And yet we have one standardized normative way of how we expect school to show up. for those who are in our school spaces. So I think that, is a potential negative understanding of the impacts that equality can have, and the ways that we absolutely use equality as a benchmark for how we deliver upon education in, the work that we do on a daily or regular basis.
Yeah, I don't know if this is relevant to this current conversation, but I feel an urge to share it. So I'm reading this book written by an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and it's called The Dawn of Everything. And it's a relatively new book. I think it was published in 2021. And they make this really strong argument that, a lot of people credit the ideas around equality from Enlightenment philosophers. And these folks make the argument that actually Enlightenment philosophers got this idea, our modern idea of equality, through interaction with indigenous peoples in the Americas. And that actually it was through interaction with tribal leaders and ways of life that some of those indigenous peoples who were living in fairly egalitarian societies and doing so peacefully, that the idea of equality started to work its way into the Eurocentric Enlightenment kind of ideas. And so the reason why I bring that up is I think sometimes what happens in school districts is that you have overwhelmingly white school board members and overwhelmingly white district leaders who think they're doing right by kids by providing a form of standardization that is kind of framed in arguments of rigor and framed of arguments of, high quality education. But the very voices or the very people they're trying to help actually are not being helped at all by the very ideas they're putting forth. Right. And I don't, there's definitely some whiteness that goes on there, some deep-seated white supremacist thinking, I think, that goes on there. But I do kind of find it ironic that a lot of that idea that we strive for, this idea of equality, actually is best represented sometimes by indigenous and BIPOC populations.
Wow.
And it's this interesting thing I've been thinking a lot about lately, especially as it relates to school and how kind of twisted the idea of equality has come over time, right? And I haven't quite, formed out clear thinking around it, but I think that's there seems to be an interesting sociological pattern there.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like a co-opting of a practice that has been perfected by a group of individuals with a spin on it, that brings in this element of dominance and how we want you to show up in service of the way that we want you to show up. Albeit we took this from some other group and are utilizing it in ways that were not the way it was originally intended. And so it may cause a consistent rift in how the experience shows up and what the outcome of that experience is for those who maybe from those very communities who are accustomed to that, style of eradication of experiences within the entire community as a whole.
Yeah. Totally agree. And that idea of co-option, I think that was one of the words I was looking for. And I think it's really fitting here.
Yeah.
All right. So we move on to equity.
I love it.
Okay. Awesome. So equity is different than equality, and it is defined as providing students with differentiated levels of support and resources in order to provide them with an equal opportunity to succeed in school. Right. So that is a very kind of baseline. It's kind of a baseline idea. And I'm just going to share kind of one way that maybe folks can think about what equity kind of looks like and why people argue for it kind of out in the world, using an example that isn't really of education. So there was I don't know if it was a study, but there was this thing that happened in Berkeley back in the 1970s where, like when you're walking in a downtown and you want to cross a street, everybody's familiar now when you're crossing the street, there's like the curb is cut out, right? And that has been, that has been come to be known as the cut curb kind of effect. So there was a bunch of folks in Berkeley back in the kind of like the 1970s who wanted to increase access to just walkable sidewalks by folks who had physical disabilities and just other folks, because there was no cutout of the curb, right? And we all know Berkeley to be like this really liberal place and really progressive place. But so they did this kind of experiment where they thought, okay, so let's take all of our sidewalks where folks would normally cross, and let's do a cutout in order to increase access to folks, who are physically disabled or just other folks. So they did this, and what they found out when they studied it is that by cutting out the curb for where you cross the street, it not only opened up access to folks who are physically disabled, it opened up access to a bunch of other people who they didn't even anticipate would need the access, like parents pushing a stroller across the street, little kids on bicycles, elderly folks who have to use a cane to get around, right? So I bring up this example from this very kind of this pretty famous study in the world of sociology, just to kind of let folks know that one of the really one of the most important, one of the most compelling arguments for equity is that if you do equity right, it doesn't just serve the folks you're trying to serve, right? It doesn't just increase the quality of life for specific populations you're trying to serve. It actually increases the quality of life for just about everybody else who has access to that resource, right? So it's when folks talk about the need for equity in school, there's very much research behind this idea that if you do it well, it actually improves all students' experiences in school, not just the specific groups you're trying to serve.
Yes. I know a lot about the cut curve or curb cut effect. I've used it in some trainings in the past. And another thing that comes up for me when thinking about the idea of equity, and, by definition, that is, if referencing the last definition around equality, this is slightly the opposite in that we are actually assessing or evaluating what it is that you need individually and are seeking to ensure that we are providing that, whether it's just for you or in general for those who are either you or folks like you with this particular need, to be able to access for, again, that success that you have put on as the coat that you're going to wear for this journey. This is your success. Another example of that non-education focused equity would be the airport. When you go to the airport, yes, we have a cut curb, whereas you can access the sidewalk to get into the airport. The doors slide open, right? That's a wonderful way to ensure that everyone has a way to walk in without having to be able to pull. Maybe I can't pull, maybe it's difficult to pull because I'm in a chair. That is disallowing me to reach, the handle to pull in. So I need someone else's support. But also when you get inside, how many varying ways are there for you to get the information that you need? There are individuals, there are agents, there are reader boards, there's sounds that are coming from microphones, getting around elevators and movable walkways. And, if you really have lower mobility, there's a man or a woman who will drive you to your gate, etc. There are so many varying ways that the airport system has thought about serving each and every individual who walks in that door. Sometimes the messages are spoken in languages different than the dominant language we speak in this country, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. When we do the job of ensuring that we are equitably serving the constituents, the stakeholders, or whomever it is that we're focusing on at this moment, society as a whole will benefit because everyone will have access to what they need in order to thrive. And that is not what we do on a daily basis in education.
Yeah, totally agree. I love that example of the airport, right? And what I love about it is that it's both super compelling because it's true, but it also gives folks a way to understand how equity is working in the background of their lives. They just may not be
That's right.
cognizant of it, right? So a lot of the folks who I hear complaining about equity, I do sometimes wonder how much they're unaware of how equity has actually improved their day-to-day lives and they just didn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
Even I think folks like, they don't even think of organization like the NFL. The reason why the NFL is as successful as they are, one of the reasons why, is that they actually build their system off equity, right? If you're, for example, the Cleveland Browns and you haven't been super successful historically, you get a first round draft pick, a really high one. So you get a chance then to move to get not necessarily special privilege, but you get an opportunity to improve, right? Based on your specific record, you get a first round draft pick, a high one, to change the fortune of your team down the road. And what that has done over time is that it's created kind of a sense of parity in the NFL when anybody can win any given week. Mm-hmm. So the idea of equity goes way beyond the educational setting. But I feel like, it gets demonized in the educational setting because folks don't actually understand how it's working. Mm-hmm. And how it should work and how it could actually benefit kids.
Mm-hmm. 100%. No offense to Cleveland Brown fans.
They've been better last couple of years. They've been better.
Y'all got some work to do, but we still love you.
Even like free and reduced lunch policy. Right. Like that was free and reduced lunch policy, which is part of, I believe, the Title I legislation that was passed way back in the 60s or 70s. It was designed in order to feed children who come to school hungry. Mm-hmm. Right. And very, very recently, there are a bunch of different schools who've made free and reduced lunch universal for all the kids who attend their schools. Right. But that's one of those like equity focused policies that have been brought into the educational system to ensure that children who live different lives outside the school can access resources where they can actually access education as equally as their peers.
Good information to know that prior to the government adopting such a practice, the Black Panther Party,
yes, it did,
absolutely initiated this effort in our community in California, Los Angeles, San Francisco communities, and it spread like wildfire and was the impetus for how we got to the free and reduced lunch programming that we have in schools today. And so please share that information. It's important to know. One thing I want to say about equity is that going back to the education piece, because we focus a lot on the non-education sectors, but going back to the education piece, we know that we're in a district of 20,000 kids. Any given building has 1,000 kids roughly or more. Each one of those individuals has a different need for how they learn, for how they process, for how they output, the amount of time they need in order to succeed, their own definition of success or succeeding. And what we offer is a very static, immovable way of how we want you to test. You got 45 minutes to do this test. Doesn't matter if you need longer. The way we grade, it's from 100 to 90, you get an A. It doesn't matter if your actual knowledge and proficiency is greater than your performance. Like, we test you on your performance of the knowledge of what you know or are supposed to know, supposed to, quote unquote. And there's so many pathways to where students and their families don't get the things that they need in order to thrive, that we really got to start putting some emphasis on equitable approaches to education. One strategy that we picked up during COVID was having the opportunity for some to experience education through a virtual experience, and some who really wanted or needed the alternative to have a space in the school building space or in the classroom space to learn that way. Unfortunately, at the beginning of this school year, we don't have as large of an option. It's much more promoted that folks come back to school. We do have an option, but many argue it doesn't feel like the similar or same option that they were offered during the height of the beginning of COVID, because in our case, it's not our teachers who are delivering that same high quality education. So we have some people who don't want it participate in that because it's not what they came to Bellevue schools for. They could do virtual learning through others online with K12education.com, right? And so there is a real need for us, not just organizationally in our region, but systemically within this sector, to find pathways to offer young people and their families the best way that they feel in order to that is going to help them to be successful in the way that they want educationally.
Yeah, Shomari, I know you're deeply involved in like family and community engagement, and I've been thinking a lot lately about how we were talking about before, how overwhelmingly white school and district leaders are defining what it means, what equitable practice is across the board. And I don't really think that's helping actually the folks we want to help. Right. And I'm wondering what you think the role of families and communities are, and just how we're even defining equity.
Yeah, like my long-term feeling about this is that we do not involve our stakeholders well enough to actually honor. I tell folks all the time, parents have PhDs in their children and what their children's needs are. They may not have a PhD on a piece of paper that somebody signed, but they definitely have professional degrees in how to serve their children well, what their children's needs are. And it's our responsibility to listen to our families and our parents who are with our kids far more often than we are for far longer hours, really struggling with them sometimes in the trenches to get through this education piece, not feeling as though they have the platform to be heard or to even offer voice. And so from the family engagement perspective, I just think that in this profession on a national scale, we've missed the mark in ensuring that we have our key stakeholders dialed in to what it is that we're seeking to do and giving them the empowerment to make the changes necessary for what is needed for their student from their household. And it's an unfortunate piece. We're seeking to reverse a little bit of that, but oftentimes it is a heavy, heavy lift to reverse some of the things that we have in place as per the expectations of what families feel when they are feeling informed, and how they get to feeling supported and what it takes for them to feel like they can actualize the empowerment that they have, that they've been made to believe that they don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's the term equity and how we think about equity. There's folks who are proponents of equity. I almost feel like there is this ethos of how do I want to put it? Like a morally anchored ideology when you talk about equity, right? That there's a lot of moral weight to the word. And I'm starting to think that unless community and unless families are involved in how different organizations are defining equity, you're actually not doing equity. You're doing what you think other folks want, but you're not taking the time to actually ask the folks who are being most harmed by the system what they actually want and need.
Yeah. And why do you think that? I mean, I have some theories, but why do you think that?
Why do I think that we don't do that? Oh, well, I mean, I think there are a couple different reasons. First, race is definitely a component to this, right? Like there's a lot of folks that look like me, who identify like me, right? White, middle class, who have come up through the ranks of the system, who've done a lot of reading of a lot of different folks, many of whom have been white, right? That we just kind of think that we know what folks should want, right? Like we cite research, and we sometimes use research as a bludgeon to tell other people what a just system should look like. And we don't ever really take the time to ask folks. And I think there is, I think, how could I put, I do wonder like how much educational leaders actually trust the communities you're trying to help. I wonder how much, yeah, right. Like I wonder how much there's actually faith that those folks are speaking on behalf of what their children actually need. So there's almost this kind of social justice colonialism, if I could call it that, right? Like where you're acting, you're trying to act in a socially just manner, or you say you are, but your actions actually betray the things you say you want to accomplish. And I don't know how much folks are actually aware that that's what's happening. Right. Yeah. And there's race and racism also, I'm sure, plays a role, right? We've been socialized into this system where we think Black and brown children are in some ways pathological or dangerous, and that we have to, right? So like engaging with their families is something that's scary to a lot of white leaders. So I think there's a bunch wrapped into it, Shomari, I think. Why do you think it's not happening?
I think it's power and meritocracy. Right? And I don't think that, yes, it has a color to it often. I think that when we talk about the terminology of whiteness, it's not necessarily white people only. It's a concept or a theory that we're like attributing to how we consistently, once we have obtained some power, how we hold on to it, and how that it now becomes ours. Like you said it earlier, and it's spot on to me that I don't really trust these families out here to be able to tell me how to do my job that I get paid money to do because people say I'm an expert in, right? So why am I going to bring in these other folks when I have the answers, or at least I feel like I should have the answers, and I don't want anyone's involvement to undermine my power, by which has been given to me as a Black man in an institution that is relatively led through a whiteness lens. I don't want to give up that power, right? Because then what does that do to me? It diminishes my ability to lead, because then someone's going to say that Shomari doesn't know that stuff. We need to just go to the source themselves, right? And so I think there's an institution of power and a fear around not having it that really does play a huge role in why we don't. And also I think about time and the impatience that people have with a methodology that is inclusive of a slower pace with the inclusion of the voices that we need to hear versus we need to make a rapid shift, quick transformation in a way that on paper at least sounds like we're heading in the right direction. I've been a part of a system for a long time that the beginning of the year, we just spent $150,000 on this brand new thing that's going to change everything. By the end of the year, we have kicked that to the curb. We're on to the next thing, right? And so and it's industry wide, and it's how a lot of these nonprofit institutions or colleges and institutions of higher learning, it's how they really establish themselves sometimes. We have a thing that's going to change everything for you, right? If you just follow this pathway that is in this box that doesn't often, I should say doesn't always give you the flexibility to, make choice, as you're making change, or provide choice as you're making change. It's a surefire way to ensure that the kids in Bellevue who receive this experience are going to, it's a surefire way to ensure that this won't happen, that the kids in Bellevue are going to have an outcome that is similar to the kids in, Florida, the kids in New York, the kids in Los Angeles, because we can't identify every single space as one that's going to perform or react or respond to what it is that we throw at it. So that's why when thinking about equity, we have to find out what the problem of practice is right here, in this very space. Sometimes it's in this classroom, sometimes it's just with this student alone. That's what IEPs are for, for us to figure out individually what you specifically need. I think every kid needs an IEP, doesn't matter what your academic performance is. I want to know what you need in order to thrive. And then my job then is to provide you with what it is that you need so that this experience is one that you look back upon and say, they have my back.
God, yeah. I that idea, right, that, when you think about it, Shomari, it's not the amount of energy that some school districts put in to researching some programs, some technology platforms, some thing right? And then going out and meeting with the consultants and then, buying the thing and hiring the consultants and all of that would never, without actually ever asking teachers or students, or if that's something that would actually help them. Like, it's one of those things that's so simple.
Yeah.
Slow down, talk to your community, bring them on board, have candid conversations about what they need, and then see if you already have the tools in the organization to address those needs.
Yeah.
And we just we totally, you're right. It takes longer to do that process. But ironically, at least then, because of the process, you should have a better thing. So you don't have to keep moving from thing to thing to thing to thing all the time, because now you actually have the thing that will actually work for the people you're actually trying to serve.
Yeah. Paul, a lot of this conversation boils down to the restructure of education as a whole. Classrooms should be smaller. I should have 12 kids in my space to be able to really put the focus on what each kid needs in order to thrive. Kids need the ability, especially when I think about secondary, to grow together and to be able to lean on one another, as opposed to I shift classrooms 6 times a day, because we have 7 classes. I don't get as entrenched in knowing the student participants, nor knowing very well my leader, facilitator, educator for that classroom space. And so there's a fragmentation throughout the day. We provide and give young people more workload capacity than adults themselves have when they go to work every day. Mostly. Really? Come on, man. This kid is 14, right? How on earth can we expect that from at least 5 of these 7 classes, you got homework every night, and your response, and you talked earlier about AP and, here in this system, we have IB, and just the rigor and the workload and the expectation of some of our kids. To me, no wonder we have such a society whereas people are experiencing education vastly differently. And also no wonder as to how there are other institutions of learning outside of this country that are thriving in ways that we are not.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a really, like you brought up the high school example, it is kind of terrible in a sense. It's really odd what we do to children. Shomari, I don't know very many adults who could, as a 45-year-old, who could pass the AP World History exam, the AP Calculus exam, the AP Biology exam, and the AP Language exam in the same year, 2 weeks apart. Right. But this is what we expect of children, right? Because we've told them that's in their best interest. Yeah. And college, let's be honest, colleges and universities have really not helped with that at all. No. Right. But it is the demands we place on children and we tell them that it's good for them in the future, but we never stop to actually ask them if that's something they actually want or need. Now, I'm not saying that all of education is 100% driven by the child. The adult influence is important, but how the system is currently constituted, where we tell kids that they have to learn all of these things, or they're going to be a horrible adult, or they're going to be a failure and, work at some minimum wage job, or have to work 3 jobs in order to this is a ridiculous model. It's you were so spot on when you said that we don't have the same expectations for adults. Yeah. But we do for 16-year-olds who at the exact time in their lives when they are not prioritizing their future selves, right? It's a baffling system when you stop and kind of take a step back.
This lady I was on a call with earlier, who I referenced prior to us press and record, she said that she has an advisor herself as an adult who owns a business, who does consulting across the country. She has a mentor advisor who said, you've got to get out of this Swiss cheese mentality of meeting, which means meeting, back to back all day long, because at the end of the day, all the things you are assigned to do during the day are due, and you need to work on it. So after work, you have to now go to work. Think about that in the way that we serve our students. You have back-to-back for 7+ hours in a day, all these things that are piling and building, and never once do you put space in between to say, all right, you learn this thing, now go apply it. Go do the homework for it, go practice it, go, re-up on an understanding of how to function excellently. And then you got every single teacher expecting you to thrive in their classroom because their classroom is most important, and so it's just a really tough piece that I think, and you mentioned our institutions of higher learning, like I think they mess it up even further by expecting us to have particular standardized testing scores and particular grades in order to even consider to get into this institution. And the problem I have is that college isn't accessible for everybody. It's not an opportunity for every person. Sometimes financially, sometimes academically, regardless, everyone should have the chance. Just like Mike Riley and this idea of AP for all, everyone should have a chance to have college for all. You can opt out. You don't have to go to college. We're not forcing or pushing people who have no interest in it to go further. But if you want to, there should be the opportunities made affordable for you to do so. That would be equality to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And then the role of the K-12 system is to take a differentiated approach to each student to ensure that each student actually has the authentic opportunity to apply and go to a school of their choosing. That's right. But right now we don't have that system. Yeah. Right. Like and to, more to your point, right. When you laid out what a kid's day-to-day life is like, especially in a high school, I think it's really important for folks to keep in mind that many of our kids, when they leave the high school, they're going home to take care of younger siblings. They're going to after-school jobs to, help put food on the table or help pay for rent, or the kids who are experiencing homelessness, or, there are any number of ways in which we have a lot of kids in the system who don't have the luxury of going home and doing the homework. Right. And then you layer on top of that the fact that the homework is not applicable to them or their background or their personal lives or how they see the world. And you see a system that assumes that because we treat every kid the same, that we're doing every kid justice. And it's just not true.
Yeah. I for a stint of time in my career in education, supervised and oversaw the work of McKinney-Vento, which serves our population of those experiencing homelessness. And just to think that this kid comes to school, chooses to come to school first. That's a major thing. Like, I'm choosing to come to school. I'm 16. I live on the street, or I live on someone's couch, or I'm living out of a car. I'm choosing to come to school to improve upon my circumstance. And we don't have an individual assessment or expectation or academic plan for this individual in a way that helps to serve them based on their circumstance, and helping to push them towards thrival, knowing that they may not have that home to safely, calmly do their homework. They may not have inspiration from others around them to see to it that they get the work done. They get the same thing coming out of the school day that any other kid who has all the access that they need in order to thrive has. And I just think that's a real shameful position for us to be in as a system. It is not equity whatsoever.
No, it's not. And, it's no wonder that kids like that and kids who are experiencing those lived experiences and kids' families who are experiencing those things come to distrust the system. Yeah. Because they recognize really, really quickly the inherent unfairness with the system's insistence to treat their kid like all the other kids in the system. And it doesn't do them any favors. It doesn't do the system any favors. It does nobody any favors, and it doesn't provide justice to anybody across the board when we take those approaches.
And I will say, Paul, in my tenure here in the ed system, I have run across several teachers who have just been rock stars. I mean, they take into account everything that's going on with the kid. They understand where they're coming from. They understand their family dynamic. They're an educator and a leader in that student's life, but also a friend, and someone who has loving accountability for advancing them forward. And those are the ones who get invited on Facebook to be friends with kids after, they've graduated. They're the ones who keep in contact with their teachers. They're the ones who, when I'm recollecting who my favorite teacher was, that's who it was, because they had my back 100%. The downside is that's not every teacher, and I mean, that does, unfortunately land into your lap quite a bit within the role that you play at Pacific Lutheran, in that as you're preparing our teachers for this next level, what is it that they're not receiving from their post-secondary experience that is not causing them to act in a way that is greatly supportive of the specific needs of families, when they get to students and families, when they get to their professional role. And some of it is policy, we're back to equality again. Yeah. Some of it is a fear and a nuance of stepping outside the bounds, especially when they're not on a continuing contract and are fighting to just get a position so they themselves can feel well and thrive. But it's something that I think it's a conversation I think we should approach on a much grander, more national scale of how do we sort of push our teacher, educator, leaders towards the justice that needs to happen for the students that sit in front of them every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Those, I know several of those teachers, and we probably know some of the same teachers in our current district. And whenever I have a chance to interact with them, and this is something that I tell my teacher candidates too, right? James Baldwin had this great line in a speech he gave called A Talk to Teachers back in the 50s or 60s, where he talked about going broke for kids, right? And that you have to, I think sometimes educators prioritize compliance to a system, which asks them to do unjust things, over serving kids in ways that can actually help kids. And, I don't want to blame teachers here at all, because teachers are put in an awful position. But it has become, I think, in many places, a professional norm to comply with policies, regardless of how detrimental they are to children and what they're experiencing currently.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, do you want to talk about racial equity?
Jump in.
And how it's different than equity? Right. So the definition that we draw from, when we're talking about it, I think, all right, so let me just read it. Racial equity reflects the field's understanding that students of color can experience compounded stress and anxiety when the implicit and explicit racism they experience outside of school is unknowingly and knowingly replicated by teachers and administrators in schools. And so it's, let's see, let me read one more sentence out of it. Educators' mistreatment of students of color is well documented and can stem from individuals' explicit or implicit bias and racism, such as racial microaggressions, and the largely invisible structural and systemic factors that impede and limit how successful children of color can be. So to me, when I think of racial equity, it is trying to address those very specific points of harm and points of trauma that children of color experience on a day-to-day basis when they're in the system.
Kids don't always even know it's happening to them. We had this conversation in our second podcast, and Ashok really took us there, talking about racial stamina. And a lot of times that is earmarked for the little bit older kid who can now understand the societal norms of, where they don't feel like they fit and how that is perpetuated in the education space when they come to school on a daily basis. The kids don't always know what's happening to them until maybe a little bit older sometimes, but when they know, it is one of the most harmful and most impacting things for a young person by way of their psyche and psychology, of how to engage in school moving forward. You see a lot of this transition happen in middle school. You're now getting into a space where you're in less of a compact, homogenous space, homogenous in that the kids don't switch classrooms. It's the same classroom every day. But when you move from this I'm gonna take care of you model to you're on your own model, there's a lot more vitriol that comes out with regard to how students treat one another that goes uncorrected. There's a lot of challenge in the ways and the mindsets that our teachers perpetuate, sometimes unknowingly perpetuate these cycles of oppression based on biases that they own and that they have, that they've not worked towards eradicating. And so we see a racial inequity or unjust environment often, especially when those who identify as of color or BIPOC are in the minority within that space, building space or district space, what have you. In this particular district, Black kids, for example, are 3%. So in any given building, even the largest of buildings with, we don't have very large buildings, 1,700 kids. Like where I went to school, we had 3,700. But still large for us, building spaces, you may find 25 Black kids in that building space at varying grade levels, 9 through 12, in different classes. So they may not actually see each other throughout the day outside of passing period and lunch, And so just thinking of the impact that it has on a young soul to walk into a space and to feel like this place does not have my back. They don't want me here. I'm of a racial background and dynamic that is not appreciated, oftentimes not uplifted, certainly not uplifted in the curriculum and the curricula that we offer as an output to our students. So how on earth could one feel proud if we're not offering and consistently engaging in things to amplify and promote how excellent you are, right? And so there is a massive distrust and a massive challenge that exists when we start thinking about racial inequity, because it's been entrenched in the way that we do education for hundreds of years. And so thinking about trying to remove a barrier that is an institution, right? Mm-hmm. That is the foundation for how we even educate, kill the Indian, save the man. You know what I mean? Like this was from way back. This is how education started, right? For a lot of people who identify as BIPOC, and has perpetuated for their family members and all the way through into themselves in ways that the entire unit, of that household does not feel connected nor compelled by their education experience. And that is a huge detriment to the perpetuation of how this particular racial subgroup stays in this place of not feeling affirmed.
Yeah, and that is when people talk about racial equity, it is similar to equity in that we need to come up with ways to better support our BIPOC communities, right? But it's the idea of equity is still part of this whole thing, right? Like it's a different thing to me anyway. It's a qualitatively different thing because of the generational harm and the generational trauma that students and families and communities have experienced in the hands of the educational system, right? So, in ways that is qualitatively different than, say, how our students who experience homelessness might feel in the system, right? At least to me, and you should correct me if I'm wrong about this, there is a different way that our students of color, in particular our Black and Brown students, experience the educational system that warrants differentiated, specific supports for those children and for those families that goes beyond how we would serve, say, our students who qualify for IEPs and special education services, or students who qualify for English language learner services, or students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, right? Like it is a specific different thing that is a moral imperative of the system.
Yeah, interesting. And each one of those things you named has a national education policy behind them saying that here's how we're going to support you as a student, as a family, as a school district, as a classroom, in providing what's necessary for these students and their families to be able to feel like they are supported, right? We've got national language behind it. It is upheld by state funding. And if we don't do it, we don't get that funding. We don't have a similar thing for racial equity. You know, I have a sweatshirt that I made up a few years ago that says equity is not a program. You're not going to program your way out of this, bro. Like, it's not happening. You know, there's no pathway towards aligning with the University of Washington, who gives us an in-the-box model and says, hey, all you got to do is roll this out and then you're good. It's not a program. It's going to take a lot of toil, you know, and a lot of very difficult work. Like, Paul Sutton is going to have a personal Paul plan on how you yourself are going to help in the movement towards the eradication of racial inequities and injustices, right? And a collective something as well. But if you're not on board as an individual with your own personal goals of how you aid in the advancement of our education system, then you're just part of the problem, you know? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you know, another way to think about this is that for generations, for hundreds of years, we've had racial equity. It's just been focused on whites.
Yeah.
Right. Like, you could go down the list of things in social policy and educational policy that have basically provided advantages to white middle class folks in the system over time. Right. So it's not as if this is something new. It's just a call to focus on the folks who actually need it, who are in the system, who are being harmed every day by the system. Right. So it's like my whole thing with culturally responsive pedagogy. Right. Why wouldn't we do it? It's been working. We know what works for white children, and it has for generations. All we're asking is that we now pivot to ensure that it works for students of color and families of color as well. Right. Yeah. Like, you know, pivoting so that we're actually focusing on the folks who need it.
I got to go back real quick, Paul, to your list of examples of where we have policy that really supports those who are having an inequitable experience. You know, those experiencing homelessness, those who are a part of our special education services, English language learning services. Now we call it MLL, or multilingual language services. Like, we have platforms to support families and students in those ways. But the thing that keeps popping up in my mind is that what we're working towards and what we're talking about today, racial inequities, they are ones that folks don't want to put emphasis on because it targets empowering those who have not been given power before. Like, there's a fear of, if we give power here, this goes back to enslavement.
Yeah.
Right. Like, we have to separate, you know, we have to take things away. We have to provide advantages to some and create a rift amongst themselves. We have to do all these things to keep this particular group or these particular groups of people disempowered in a way that allows for some to remain in power. And that's a real challenge to overcome, because what we're talking about here with racial equity really falls in alignment with removing power from those who have it.
Yeah. I mean, that is a heck of a rabbit hole to have to go down. But I think I totally agree with you on that. And I think the fear that some people have, you know, they have a right to fear. You know, they have a right to feel whatever they want to feel. But I don't want to live in a world. I'm tired of living in a world where the usual folks have most, and, you know, the folks who don't have enough are always the same folks. Like, it's by not doing anything you are complicit with the system remaining the same, with sustaining an unjust system, right? And I personally, I wonder. So let me turn this into a question, Shomari. How can we think about this in a way so that people don't fear empowering folks of color, right? Like, how do we cut through the fear and anxiety that some folks have that if you put into place policies that prioritize racial equity, that they're going to lose something or their kid is going to lose something?
I don't know that that is an answerable question even, right? Because, that's what we've been trying to do think about the civil rights movement. How long ago was that? We're still doing the same thing, bro. Okay. Like there's some challenges here with even on a grander scale with national leaders really pushing and driving towards a much more just and a much more sound societal way of being as a country, even with all that effort and money and, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people on the right side of justice. We still didn't win. We didn't win that battle. And I don't understand. I'm having a couple of sleepless nights here lately. And the other day I woke up at 1 a.m. and I couldn't do anything but watch TV. And so I watched the documentary on the January 6th events at the Capitol. It was a 2-hour.
Shomari, your audio went out.
One moment. Okay, am I back?
You are.
Okay, so I had a chance to watch this documentary. The documentary of the January 6th events at the Capitol depicted groups of people, tens of thousands of people who were landed upon DC and forcibly found their way into the Capitol building. And the amount of 1950s, 1960s, exact same conversations of what we're trying to eradicate were on clear and present display with folks yielding Confederate flags through the Capitol building. I heard Wolf Blitzer the other day talk about there was a gentleman in one of the images with a Auschwitz shirt on, like in full support of what happened to my grandparents. My grandparents were killed in Auschwitz, and this person is promoting, and just the amount of understanding of how far we have to go. Present day, when we talk about critical race theory, which a lot of people don't understand, but they're fighting against because they believe that it is inculcating their children with an understanding that they don't want their children to have. Our battle is very, very far away. It doesn't mean that any of us should take our feet off the gas pedal. You need to know where we are in order to get to where we want to go. And I think that we're far, far away from even being capable of answering that question you posed. Yeah.
I was worried that was going to be your answer, but I thought I would ask the question anyway. Right. So you spend a lot of time in community, Shomari, and your work is you spend a lot of time talking to folks, families, and other stakeholders in the community, and you do boom and shout. So what are some things? What does racial equity look like in your average public school?
In my public school setting, based on what I try my best to do, and as I consult with others in this space, it is the normalizing of folks from our BIPOC community feeling served. It is bringing together of individuals who have not felt included in the system. It is providing a platform and a space for folks to have choice and voice towards what their outcomes that they so choose will be. Some of it is policy change. That's a little more difficult because I don't get to change the policy. I get to provide input or perspective or experiences from my life or the life of those who I seek to serve. But policy change is huge because in our type of organization, a lot of people follow the rules. They adhere to what is being told of them, that this must happen in this particular way. And so if we can change the ways that we expect folks to do things, then we can change the outcomes that students are experiencing. And so I do some things that are deliberately focused on students and students feeling affirmed. Like Boom, that's the shirt I'm wearing today, breaking out of the margins. It's an experience for young men of color to come together and listen to speakers and have breakout sessions where they get to actually discuss what the challenges are they're experiencing and how to overcome, and take with them away from that experience opportunities to collectively work alongside other students and those very adults who help to develop their understandings of, the direction they want to go. But also I think about family engagement strategies and bringing more voices of color, having listening circles and healing circles that are facilitated and led by our policymakers and our district leaders, so that there's a fundamental understanding that we can't just blanketly offer what we believe based on our children's experiences is the right thing to do. We actually want to enlist the voices of those who we're presently serving. And then next year, we're going to be serving some new people. So let's have some new conversations next year. And every single year, it has to change. It's evolving. We can't say that today we're going to put in place this program, which equity is not a program. We're going to put in place this program and we're not going to fact check, or do any cycles of improvement to ensure that we're on the right track. Like, that's just wrong. You have to evolve just like the demographics of your school building space are evolving, just like someone graduates in 12th grade and someone new comes in ninth, right? Like, there's a constant evolution and we have to adhere to that evolution.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like, on the classroom level, when I think of, practices and strategies and just pedagogies that further racial equity in the classroom, I mean, I think people would be surprised that, like you said, it's not really a program. It's essentially having teachers in classrooms who understand the legacy of the public education system, who understand the different ways students are presenting in the classroom, and that those ways of presenting are very legitimate based on those students' experiences. And then I want those teachers, I try to prepare folks to be the kind of teachers that then creates communities of belonging and safety and caring and love in their classrooms, so that every student they serve feels like they're safe, feels like they can belong in that space according to who they truly are. And until we do that, until we get to the point where we have teachers who have really specific skills on how that should work and are able to enact those beliefs into practices, the students who we're trying to serve won't be able to show up and be ready academically to learn the content we have to learn. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, I think we have enough educational research out there now that shows that unless children feel a sense of belonging in a classroom, they really, really struggle to learn the academic content we're trying to teach them.
Yeah.
Right. So, and it's this relational pedagogy that I think teachers have to adopt in the classroom, and realize that unless you do that, it doesn't matter how much content you cover, your students ain't going to learn it.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, there are all these little things on top of the family engagement things that you talked about that are just these wonderful ideas of how a district can stay nimble and stay connected to the community and initiate policies that actually are policies that reflect the desires and needs and wants of the community they're trying to serve, right? There are all these little things that can happen also in the classroom that I feel like are just, and it should be pointed out, what I just talked about, right? Establishing a classroom where every student feels a sense of belonging demands that teachers understand the unique balance between ideals of equality and ideals of equity at the same time in a classroom space, right? Working simultaneously for every child in that space.
Yeah, and if I were speaking to educators, and I don't want to put an emphasis on white educators, I want to say educators in general, there's a couple of concepts. A, constant growth. We have to constantly educate ourselves on what's happening. And in that vein, you really got to start asking more questions than providing more answers, right? Like our students at my age, I realized that the students that I serve today are not having the experience that I had 40 years ago, 35 years ago. This is a new student. They've evolved differently. The things that they learn and know when they show up are different, right? The things that they're able to articulate that I was never able to articulate until I was an adult, they know, they have it in their back pocket. There are conversations that are happening on social media, on regular media, in the news. There are things that are developing our kids in ways that are far advanced than we were developed when we were of that age. And so we have to entrust in our young people that they know what the hell they're talking about, and that they need to be stakeholders in the process of ensuring that their success is met, not just I'm looking at you, I'm evaluating your mannerisms and behavior. I'm deciding that you need to do a particular thing in order to be successful in my classroom. That's not it. Like we have to find a way to work alongside. This is a partnership, and so in that partnership, like we can't have any conversations about bootstraps. We ain't pulling up no bootstraps, man. Like that's just not this game right now, right? Like not everyone has been given a fair shake or an opportunity to have advantage to access the things that are important for them to thrive. And so like you have to ask those questions, like what is it going to take for me to show up in a way that helps you feel supported, and feels empowered and is able to thrive moving throughout your K-12 experience. And then maybe we'll start getting somewhere. And that is an everyday practice, outside of the policy transformation, outside of the dismantling and the recreation of the system. That's an everyday practice that we should already be doing as we seek to find strategies to continue to ensure that the system that the next generation of kids come into is not the system that we have today.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I both share this idea that the children, let's be honest, once you get a child into high school, they are essentially experts on teaching and learning, given the number of teachers they've experienced and the number of hours they've spent in classrooms. They are the very people in the system we never ask for advice on how we could get better, right? And as you were talking, Shomari, it made me think that like, I can picture, somebody listening to this episode out on a walk, walking their dog, and, perhaps a white person. And I think when that person is thinking about how these three concepts, in particular equity and racial equity, work in the educational system, I think it's really important that that person understands that many of the ways they've been socialized to talk about why schools are successful and why they fail are racially informed in ways they may not quite understand. And that we have to stop talking about kids as being A kids or F kids. We have to stop talking about kids as being, kids who learn quickly and kids who learn slowly. We need to stop being afraid of sending our kids into diverse learning spaces. We have to stop thinking of whole communities, whole groups of communities of color as somehow pathological or somehow less than, just because we think that we look at the educational data and those families and those communities, the data that shows up on the achievement gap is not a reflection of their potential. It's a reflection of the structure of the system not being flexible enough to serve them. Like we have to stop ourselves from making all of these assumptions about children and families and communities of color and start asking questions about why this keeps happening and why nothing better is being done to serve these families and these communities, and why we're not empowering them to be part of the conversation. That's kind of my my hope if somebody is listening to this, they realize that everything they've been taught to think about what makes a good school and a bad school is fed on these false narratives about how children and groups of people perform in academic settings. Mm-hmm. And that is part of the problem, right? Them thinking those things is part of the problem, and that they have to rethink how they're thinking in order for us to even start to make progress.
Yeah. I think about, one of the things that I do personally to try to spread my truth and to try to get out the word of these are the conversations we should be having is spending time with you, whether we're doing this podcast or we're sitting on a committee together. We're constantly in a discourse around sharpening one another's swords. Mm-hmm. One thing that I think that I can offer as an opportunity for those who may not have the positionality to actually make the changes on the district level, the policy level, the building level, even sometimes, is to do your best to serve those within your sphere of influence. You don't have to wait for the school building or the district office or the board members to create a thing that tells you have to do something different. You can query a small subgroup of your students and ask some poignant questions on how you become a better facilitator, teacher, leader, supporter of those in your classroom space. You can have a listening circle with a couple or a handful of parents or families from your classroom that can help to enlighten how to best serve that student who you're at a loss for. You're not really serving, and you're not serving them, but you keep on keeping on anyway. That's an injustice. The kid has a way that is carved out for them to learn best. You just haven't figured it out yet. And that's your job, and so the power needs to be shifted back onto each individual in the system in a way that affirms them towards advancing themselves, advancing their knowledge, advancing their understanding of those who are in front of them or those who are supporting those who are in front of them. And it's going to help them to be a better educator, big time.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's important, again, that the folks who aren't educators and yet who deeply care about the education their child is receiving. I guess if maybe there's one or two things I would love for those folks to think about is that, in lots of ways, probably and maybe the most important ways, the system, it's fine if the system is treating your child, but that doesn't mean it's any more just. Right. And that if we're not all trying to do something to work in community with other folks to make the system more just, then we're complicit in the injustice.
That's right.
Right. And so, whatever it takes to try to figure out a way to become involved, but not involved where you walk into one of those spaces. And especially if you're a white person, you think that your idea has to be the idea. Right. And we've talked a lot about this before, the role of humility when you're walking into spaces where you're trying to problem solve chronic problems. And, again, the health of the system does not just entirely depend on the extent to which your child is successful. The health of the system depends on us all trying to join arms and, make sure the system is working for everybody. Because if it's not working for everybody, it's really not working for anybody very well. That's right. And just try to stay focused on that kind of thinking, right? Because if not, nothing's really ever going to get better, right?
And to be honest, the entire world is not built up of democracies, but we live in one. And in this democracy, we say that students have free access to public education. But is that access to this public education that we're offering most or best serving them? We have people who come from communities outside of ours who are pining for an opportunity to get this education. And those within our spaces, within our country, within our districts here in the US, sometimes are not being served in the ways that will best benefit them in the long run. And so we also, from a democratic standpoint, have to find a pathway towards bolstering our nation and staying strong and competent. Again, Watching the most recent documentary I watched really put me in a bit of a tizzy, because it's obvious that we have failed some people by educating them around the things that have happened to people, the things that have happened to get us to the places that we are. And I think that is our responsibility, to continue to offer opportunities for folks to grow. This for Paul and I is an opportunity to spread the wealth of understandings that we have come up with. And not everything even we understand. Sometimes we're talking and posing questions, and we're giving opinions about what those things feel for us, and we don't have resolution or solution. But nonetheless, we're having the conversation and seeking to continue to improve ourselves, to make sure that we are doing the most that we can to infiltrate the system in a way that's positively affirming for those who've not had a system of support before.
Yeah, agreed. Are we pretty much done? I mean, we've been talking for like an hour and a half again.
That's crazy. How do we do that?
I don't know.
We were talking about 3 definitions today.
I know. That's it.
We had a good 30 minutes worth of content, but
yeah,
not.
Maybe a little bit more than 30 minutes. Yeah. Well, it was great. We talk about these things all the time, but it was nice to actually kind of forefront these in a conversation and give folks a little bit of insight into how we approach the work, and, how we work together to approach the work. And that what you and I talked about is just scratching the surface. There have been dissertations and books and like numerous, uncountable texts written about these things. So folks should go out and not take our word for it, and go out and read stuff, and get connected, and spend time with groups of folks who don't look like you, and just learn as much as you can.
That's a great suggestion too, right? Don't take any one person's word for it. We have a multitude of varying perspectives that exist around each and every one of these subject matters that we're going to be discussing in any of these podcasts. So, this is one step forward towards you gaining some layer of expertise in this field that you're speaking to or speaking towards. But there are lots of other resources out there. Watch other podcasts, read a couple of books or articles. Sometimes I have a hard time with the education articles, even though we've written one or some. But mostly the reason why I have some challenge with it is that a lot of times folks are authoring something for the purpose of being published, but don't have any context. They're not advocating for, what's happening at the actual school building or school district level. They've never been in a classroom outside of their experience in K-12, even though they may be a professor or a leader at a, post-secondary education institution now. And so I just think it's really valuable to challenge everything. When you're listening to our podcast and others, write down questions or things that were concerning to you, or things that you completely disagree with, and then ask somebody else, or research like a different article, podcast, or book about that very topic to get a nuanced understanding that we're not offering. And that's how you become great in this realm. Your greatness is going to come from how much you ingest, and then secondly, how you pay that forward, what you now know. Yeah, totally agree. All of that is really important, really, really important work. I appreciate folks listening to the extent that they do, but I really, really hope they don't take just you and me as experts as end all be all, right? There's lots of other folks out there who are working in the field who have other perspectives to share. So it was great spending this time with you, my friend. Absolutely, man. I think it's nap time. I think so. It's 3:00 on the West Coast, buddy. It's nap time. That's right. Absolutely. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you listeners. Again, I'm Shomari Jones, Director of Equity and Strategic Engagement from the Bellevue School District, here with my buddy Paul. And we are having a blast helping to transform lives and to bring a little bit of nuance to the experience that you yourself have had in your K-12 experience, whether it be K-12 in me sitting in that seat, or K-12 and me facilitating those sitting in that seat. We're grateful for the opportunity to be here with you and to share with you the things that we think we know as we continue to move forward towards becoming greater in our knowledge of these things. So thank you.
Thank you. See you later.
Alrighty.